Okay, well, let's begin our second hour. This one will be a little shorter, although I said that last time and it ended up not being. But we're just studying Esther, which is a well-known book. In fact, I wanted to start by us taking turns, not necessarily, I'm not calling on anybody, but just tell us the story of the book of Esther, because it's well-known. What's a part of it somebody wants to start with? Yes?
Queen Vashti wouldn't come before the queen, so he ordered her to go away.
Okay, so Queen Vashti wouldn't come before the king, so he ordered her to go away, and then what else happened?
Kind of has this beauty contest to find out who her replacement's going to be.
Yes, and Esther is chosen. What else happens?
Mordecai saves the king.
Yeah, that's right.
Probably not next in the story.
Who's Mordecai?
Her uncle.
Uncle, cousin. Some tradition says it was her husband. I can talk about that if we're interested. But anyways, Mordecai is related to Esther, and he was sitting at the gate and heard of a conspiracy, and he let the king know, and the king was saved. All right, what else? Adia? I'm sorry? Either way?
This guy named Haman, and he does not like Mordecai.
Haman does not like Mordecai. Or the Jews, that's right.
He won't bow to him.
He won't bow down, that's right.
And he actually gets the king to issue an edict to allow them to destroy the Jews.
Yes. Isaiah, you have one? Or is that what you were going to say?
And then, yeah.
Where's Haman from? Do you remember? So Amalek, he's an Agag. So remember the story of Samuel and Agag, Haman the Agagite. So there's some bad blood between the one that the Amalekites, remember when Israel was leaving Egypt, they kind of harassed them and picked off their weakest ones, and so God said that they were never going to make peace with Amalek, and then Agag was a descendant, and Samuel was supposed to destroy everything. And remember, he kept the best of the sheep to sacrifice, and he spared Agag. Remember, Samuel got in there and killed Agag. All right, so that was Haman issued that. They were going to kill all the Jews. What happened next?
Esther went to the king.
Esther went to the king because Esther was what? What? She was Jewish and she was the queen. That's right. So she went to the king. And what did she do?
Invited him to dinner, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Said, I'd like to have a dinner together. That's right. And they had a dinner together, and he said, what would you like? He said, well, I'd like to have another dinner. And then what happened? What happened in between there? What did Haman do?
Haman went to the dinner.
But before, in between the two dinners, what did he do?
He went to his home, and he started talking about hanging
Yeah.
Mordecai.
What did he make?
Gallows.
A big old gallows. Yeah, made a big old gallows for Haman. And then he went, and he was really proud that he was invited to this dinner, right? And then what happened next?
Well, earlier in the story, too, the king was reading one night when he couldn't sleep.
Yes.
He read about what Mordecai had done. They had chronicled that and written it down. So he was going to honor Mordecai. But Haman thought he was going to honor him.
Yes, so he honored him. Haman had to lead him through the city and proclaim how good Mordecai was. And that's when the eve before the second dinner, it was a different story. His wife was saying, well, you're not going to be able to stand against him if this has happened. And then sure enough, at that second banquet, right, Haman was revealed as one who was trying to kill all of Esther's people, and Esther was revealed as Jewish. And the king issued a decree to reverse it, right, so that the Jews could defend themselves. And that's where the holiday of Purim comes from, which we'll talk about. All right, so that's the story of Esther. I knew we knew it for the most part, but I just wanted to rehearse it and talk through it. Esther is interesting in that it's almost has a love-hate relationship for people. And what I mean by that is people either love it or hate it. There are surprisingly, let me read this quote. I'm going to back away here to read it for you. The book of Esther presents a delightfully told story of Jewish life in the diaspora. That's just the scattered Jews. Among Jews who did not return from exile, but who settled down and flourished again in a foreign land. It tells of a Jewish girl's rise to become queen of Persia and of her intercession to save her people at a time of crisis. It shows things working out well for the Jews beyond their fondest hopes. That's what we just described. Strikingly, the book has provoked some of the strongest reactions, both pro and con, of any book of the Bible. It has been denounced as a secularized, sub-Christian, or sub-Jewish book at one extreme. Can you think of a reason why somebody would say that about it?
God is
It never mentions God once in the book.
Also, Esther's behavior is called into question.
A little bit, right? She's in cahoots with this pagan Gentile king. And it has been, on the other hand, elevated to a status essentially equal to the Torah on the other end of the extreme. We'll talk about that in just a second. Negative reactions to the book of Esther are primarily because of its lack of mention of God, its essentially secular nature, as well as its allegedly vindictive spirit. At the end, we can read that section if we've got time, about how they want to get further vengeance on their enemies, and they call for a second day to be able to have vengeance on their enemies. And narrow Jewish nationalism. Thus, for example, Martin Luther wrote, "I'm so hostile to 2nd Maccabees and to Esther that I could wish they did not exist at all, for they Judaize too greatly and have much pagan impropriety." Martin Luther was never one to mince words. Slightly less hostile was Samuel Sandmel, a Jewish scholar, who nonetheless stated, "If somehow or other the canon were to become open in the 20th century, I would be among those who would vote to exclude Esther." It is interesting, and that's on the sort of the hate side of the love-hate relationship. It's the only Old Testament book that was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 40s in Israel. Lots of manuscripts much earlier than we had ever before of the Hebrew Scriptures, and Esther was not found there. It's never quoted from in the New Testament. It was actually rejected by the Eastern Church. You've heard of the Eastern-Western Church split. It was rejected by the Eastern Church until about the 4th century. No church fathers ever wrote commentaries on it, and rarely comment on it at all. First commentary devoted to it appears in like the 9th century. So, there are folks that kind of avoid it and don't think it's a book that perhaps should be in the canon. On the other hand, as was mentioned in that quote, there's some folks that raise it to a really exalted level in the same way that people think of the Torah. Let me read another quote for you. The book itself is the only one of the Old Testament outside of the Torah to have a second Targum devoted to its exposition. So unlike those Christian commentators that I said there wasn't, the Jewish commentators have spent more time on it than other books, or some Jewish commentators. The number of Midrashim and other Jewish commentaries on it exceed those written for any other book of the Old Testament. Its esteem in the Jewish community is often estimated by quoting the saying of the famous Jewish scholar Maimonides, that when the prophets and the writings pass away, so that's the writings are, Esther's actually part of the writings, but Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel, Lamentations, and obviously the prophets we've studied in here, the former prophets and the latter prophets. That scholar said, when those write away, only Esther and the Torah will remain. Its significance can further be seen in the fact that the second commandment, remember what the second commandment is? What does that mean? Don't make any idols. That's our scissors for our remembering. The second command, don't make any idols, had been interpreted in Jewish circles to prohibit all forms of representation of the human figure by the time of the Middle Ages, but this prohibition was not applied to the decoration of the scroll of Esther. So they would decorate it. They would put all kinds of fancy, drawings and figures on these scrolls. The impressive and artistic illustrations with which Jews have adorned the scroll of Esther throughout the centuries gives eloquent expression to the affectionate regard in which they have held the book. Indeed, the illumination of Esther manuscripts has preserved some of the finest examples of medieval Jewish art. So overwhelming is its popularity and acceptance that the tendency on the part of Christian scholars, when discussing problems with the book of Esther, which was what we talked about before, like the Martin Luther quote, to quote the exceedingly rare occasions when Jewish scholars have questioned its canonicity, is utterly misleading. So, on the one hand, it's a revered book in the Jewish canon. So, it's really interesting that it would have such love, hate, nothing in between. It's either really held in very high esteem or sometimes considered a more secular book that shouldn't be in the canon. Reasons why, maybe for it. It is an amazing story, and I'm going to pass something out here. We have 2 handouts today that, in my mind, really it shows how it's such a well-written story, and really, you heard the kids quoting parts of the story. It's delightful to children as well. When we would sit down and read and say, hey, what do we want to read? Let's, before we started reading through the Bible, they'd say, well, let's read Esther. It's always Esther or Ruth, just delightful stories. It is a beautiful story. Again, I know there's a vindictive part we can talk about at the end, but it's beautifully written. Purim has become a very popular feast among the Jewish festivals. We'll talk a little bit about that, but they go hand in hand. The book of Esther is where we learn about Purim. In fact, if you ask 9 out of 10 people, they'll say the reason for the book of Esther in the canon is to explain the genesis of Purim, the feast, because it's not one of those feasts that is mentioned in the Torah. I don't think that's the purpose for Esther, but that being a popular feast, the book is kind of propelled along with it. Against it, we mentioned no mention of God, the law, temple, covenant, prayer, worship, nothing mentioned throughout the book. And there's opportunities for it to be mentioned, to be sure. In fact, the Greek version of the Old Testament, the LXX, added some chapters that do have those things. It was almost like they were trying to compensate for that. And the LXX and the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation, have additional chapters. And then we mentioned the vindictive spirit of Esther. Yes?
So was there a basis for adding? I mean, why did they think they had the authority to add to it, I guess?
So there's a, and that's a bigger question in terms of what makes the canon. But there was, Esther is supposedly, in Jewish history, is the last book added to the canon. It's not the last book chronologically. Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah come after it. But it was the last book added to the canon by the Great Assembly, it's called. A lot of people point to Ezra as one of the key people who did that. But, there were writings like the Maccabees that Martin Luther mentioned after that were written after. And there were certainly more oral tradition and Jewish written tradition that didn't make the canon. And so, even in the time of Jesus, there were arguments. Marcion was a gentleman's name who wanted to strike certain portions of the Old Testament out. So it was not open for debate, but it was certainly less solid or solidified than it is today. Where there would, Martin Luther or the other quote that said, if we could open it, because I don't think anybody considers that now, there was still, discussion around what material should be in and shouldn't be in. Even in the LXX, in the Greek translation of Jeremiah, there is a lot of additional material that's not there. And so, likely, Jeremiah and the prophets did compile materials. We talked about in Kings how they, there was likely one author who compiled a lot of materials and used what suited his purpose in that. And so there were other materials that existed for sure. But we'll see when we talk about the structure of Esther, there are arguments against adding materials. You were asking for the arguments for, but there are definitely arguments against it that we'll see. I'm going to shoot for something in between the two of the love-hate. On the one hand, I totally believe it should be in the canon. It's been in the canon. It was chosen to be in the canon by the faithful remnant who was responsible for our Old Testament canon. Faithful remnant of Israel, the Great Assembly as it's referred to in the Jewish writings. On the other hand, I don't know that it's, like the law and prophets are going to, the prophets and writings are going to pass away and it's the only thing that's going to remain. So I'm going to shoot for something more in the middle. And I want to talk about a little bit and answer even to Beverly's question about the structure of Esther. We haven't talked much about that, mainly because we haven't had time with the large books of Kings and Samuel and Chronicles. But this is a small book, and I actually have a handout that, Isaiah, if you would help again. I want to pass out. I'm going to keep one. So I have it. And
Luther also
James, that's right. Luther thought James, yeah, he was not.
Probably the right straw you put this. I never understood what that works.
So we've talked a little bit about Hebrew structure or Hebrew style, and we've talked about how they didn't have. I don't think twice about printing 10 of these things. I'll print 12, I'll print 14, and I wasted a whole back of the side. I don't even think about that. It's so easy. Well, that wasn't the case when they're writings, and so they didn't have things like outline and bold and ways that we use, tables of contents and indexes and things like that. Chapter headings. They didn't have that. And so they used other means of ordering and organizing their works. We mentioned in Samuel that particle, now it happened after the death of, was indicative almost like once upon a time. And so they had many tools that they used like this. We could talk about Hebrew parallelism. Frank will talk about probably soon when he gets into Job and Psalms and Proverbs. This is something called chiasm, and it was another technique they used. And chiasm comes from the Greek letter chi, which is like the letter X in English. It's Christos, if you've heard that. The Greek word for Christ starts with the letter chi. And it's just an X, essentially, pronounced ka. In fact, I don't know if my font will come through here. It might look like a C. No, it worked. Okay. So the reason they call these chiasms is because of the shape of the letter. It goes into a middle and it comes back out. So I think I've got some animation in here to show that. So in one way and out the other. And it's a common way that Hebrew writings use to organize and present what they're writing and to really put emphasis on things. Here's some examples really small, like within one verse. Here's some examples. The last shall be first and the first last. So we can write that a little different to show that sort of chiastic structure by saying the last shall be first. I'm pressing something, I don't know what. The last shall be first and the first last. Or we can write it even more clearly like that. The last shall be first, and you can begin to see that sort of coming in and then going back out. Just going to make sure my...
Yeah, I don't know.
I've never seen that before. Okay. Another example. This is Psalm 19:1. This is how it's written in English. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanses declaring the work of his hands. Now in the Hebrew original, it's written like this. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, the work of his hands is declaring their expanse. And you can do that in Hebrew because in English we do everything by word order. Subject always comes first. In Hebrew and in Greek, you can tell which is the subject by looking at the word. It's written different if it's the subject versus if it's the object of the verb. And so you can do these kind of things, and you can begin to see how the author chooses his word order in order to do this sort of chiastic structure, even in a small verse like this. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, the work of his hands is declaring their expanse. One more example, a very commonly known verse, whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed. And you can begin to see the corresponding elements here in each of the chiasm. Well, Esther, as I've given you, the whole book is structured that way. And that's not uncommon. Again, we see that in Kings, we see that in Isaiah, lots of books, we see that in Judges have that as their structure. And it helps because you can see the centerpiece, you can see what's emphasized by the author, you can see often things that change and reverse, and those are always interesting, like we'll see that a lot in Esther. Reversal is even going to be a big theme in the book of Esther. I got this, and I have it on your sheet of paper as well, from an article by Gordon Johnston with just a few changes that I made, very little. It's all his work primarily. And so what I want to do is just have us look at this together and just see how the story is a very delightful story, the way it's written, the way it's told. So you see, for instance, let's just take, for example, the Mordecai's strategic appeal in chapter 4. It's titled Response there. And you can see how you have the Jews lamenting over that first edict that King Ahasuerus allowed Haman to make, where all the Jews were going to be destroyed on a certain day. And you remember there was weeping and lament among the Jewish community worldwide as they heard of that. You see how that's compared in the second half of the story that kind of unwinds with the Jews in Susa rejoicing over the second royal edict, which allowed them to rise up and defend themselves. Similarly, in there, you see Mordecai persuading Esther. Remember that? Esther wasn't sure she wanted to go because she knew it was at risk to her life if she would go to the king if he hadn't called her. In the same way, Mordecai in the response is persuading Ahasuerus to issue that second edict. Different kind of persuasion. But all that, you can see the author is really telling the story in a certain way, a very beautiful way, and puts the focus, interestingly enough, on that inability of the king to sleep during the night in between the two banquets, the night that the king couldn't sleep. So it's clearly the point of emphasis for the author in the book of Esther. Now again, you ask yourself, clearly, why didn't the author give that as an opportunity to give glory to God and say, God kept the king from sleeping. Because that's clearly, in the context of the Bible, we know that that's what we're to understand. There's a reason the king couldn't sleep. There's a reason he just so happened to turn to the part of the historical records to put himself to sleep that we're talking of Mordecai, right? Why is that? Well, first let me just say, it's not the only place where we have this kind of language. Think about Ruth, right? If you think about Ruth, it says she just happened onto the fields of Boaz, a close relative, right? And even in the book of Ruth, which does mention God, still has this language of just so happening upon him. We see God's providential hand. We talked last week about Ezra and Nehemiah, how it was so different from Exodus, where in Exodus you had the miraculous works, you had the arm of God showing his strength and his might and his power in delivering his people, where you see here you have the hidden hand of God, his providential hand. The hand of the Lord was upon me to keep the enemies from coming. It wasn't that he came and fought the enemies and made an earthquake and swallowed him. It was that his hand was there and he kept them from discouraging the people. And his hand was on them. He didn't want to ask for help for the king. He just wanted to go back. He didn't want to tell the king, I think God wants us to be there, but he can't get us there. So they went without a convoy, and the hand of the Lord was upon them and made it there safely. Not miraculously, but safely. And so you see in a lot of these books, and I think it's going to be important, the last slide where I talk about where Esther fits into the canon, to explain why that is. Because again, these are writings that are meant to be a part of the remnant, the people after the book of Kings. After God has quit showing mercy, he's going to exile the people. Now what? Well, there's these writings that are available to the Jewish remnant. And this is going to be really important to that group of people. So in that sense, it's very similar to some of those other writings, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth. But still, there is a difference about it. There is still a difference. And the main difference, I think, between it and especially Ezra and Nehemiah, it's even a different section where Ezra and Nehemiah, I'll show you that in just a second. If you think about the difference here, what were the people in Ezra and Nehemiah doing when God's hand was upon them?
Rebuilding the temple in the city.
They were rebuilding the temple in the city. They were traveling back, right? They were restoring the law of God. What are Esther and Mordecai doing? They're living. They're in these Gentile kingdoms. They're not making any effort to go home. They're just out among the diaspora or among the exiles, and they're just there, right? That's going to be important, I think, when we talk about the purpose of Esther. Esther comes before Ezra and Nehemiah, and I think the purpose is to show God's hand and providential care for and still love for even those Jews who are scattered. To me, it's an encouragement for people like Ezra and Nehemiah to say, let's go back. So here you have a group of people. Does God care at all? In fact, we're going to see, I wish I would have put the slide earlier now that I keep referencing it. We're going to see that Esther follows Lamentations. Lamentations is the story, obviously, of God's decision not to have mercy on the nation anymore and the terrible things that happened as a result of the fall of Jerusalem. And it ends with a little bit of a note of hope, but it says, unless you have utterly cast us off. That's how the book ends. And so Esther is an answer to that. He has not utterly cast them off. And he is caring for them in the diaspora. He's caring for them in the exile, and he still cares for Israel. He's not turned away from them. He's still going to care for them, even if not in a miraculous way he did when they were in the land and the way he will in the future. But he cares for them and he's watching out for them. And that should provide the kind of hope for that what follows, Daniel, Nehemiah, Chronicles, that should encourage the people that God is going to restore them in the land, and they ought to go back and start preparing for that. So let me put that purpose up. God's love for Israel extends even to those Jews who are not actively seeking the restoration of his kingdom on earth, and thus he will providentially care for them in accord with his covenant promises made to the nation as a whole. And that's where I think it's purposeful that you don't have a mention of God in there. You don't have the temple. You don't have prayer. It follows Lamentations, which laments missing all those things. And it is the state of the people. That's the state of the nation of Israel. They are not to a large degree seeking God. They don't have the temple. They're not thinking to the same degree of God as they ought to. And Esther shows that God, in the same way that Ezekiel does, we're going to get into Ezekiel, we're going to show that God in Ezekiel is going to promise to go with them into exile. And here Esther in the writings is a similar story where, yes, they're out in exile. Yes, they're the people. Mordecai has a great opportunity in chapter 4 when he says to Esther, if you don't do it, help will come from somewhere else. What a great opportunity to say that God will bring, but he doesn't, And so, again, it shows that the people aren't really seeking God at that time, but yet God still cares for them and is going to keep them providentially. And so I think that's why you don't have, to me, it is obvious if you're looking at it from that perspective that God is the center of the book. I think of Proverbs and how Proverbs teach that God can turn the heart of a king like he does the waters of a river. He can turn it whichever way he wants. And it's very clear that God is the one causing the insomnia in this, that turns. And it's almost more impressive that God can do it that way than he used just his mighty power. It's just amazing that he can work that out, even those small little details. It's almost just as miraculous as if he would have come and brought plagues on Haman to stop it, as he did in Egypt. That's the perfect statement of Esther. Major themes, again, because of that, the providence of God, I think, is the major theme in this book. It's emphasized by the structure. Again, the author is clearly trying to point out that the king couldn't sleep for a reason. It's implied in that verse I just mentioned earlier from Mordecai when he's speaking to Esther. And again, it extends even to the bedroom of the world's greatest ruler. And we showed how massive Persia was. Only Greece had a larger domain. Maybe Rome would be comparable, but just massive empire. And God's in control of that. And he's caring for Israel in the midst of that. The hiddenness of God, again, the book itself, the content of the book, he's not mentioned in it. And though he's not recognized by those people, God is still working. All right, Israel versus Amalek is a major theme here. Mordecai the Jew, we don't have that language anywhere else in the Bible. It's really, most of the Bible is a Jewish context, and it's the Gentiles. But here, it really emphasizes the Gentile context of it. It's Mordecai the Jew versus Haman the Agagite. Mordecai is descended from someone named Kish. It's not the same Kish as Saul's father, but he's a Benjamite from a man named Kish. It makes you think a lot about Saul when you hear that. And Haman is an Agagite, so you're in your mind, you're thinking Saul and Agag. It's causing you to think about those things. In fact, it's really interesting. I mentioned about Saul's disobedience. If you look at the vindictive chapter, the vindictive chapter 9, where some of the people don't like Esther because of its vindictive nature, it's really interesting to see the emphasis of the author. 3 times it says that when they were defending themselves, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 14th day of the month and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The rest of the Jews rid themselves. They killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. It just keeps repeating it, which again makes you remember Saul and his unwillingness to do that, right? And so that's an interesting reference back or remembrance of how it was in the days of Saul. I've got a few verses here about Amalek and just remembering what he did when they left Egypt and God's command that he will utterly, or declaration that he'll utterly blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. He wants Israel to remember what Amalek did to them. And here you see God doing that in the book of Esther providentially. And reversal. Again, the structure of it, you see that. So I've just called up a few of the ones that you can see. The differences between Mordecai tearing his clothes, whereas putting on a royal robe. King taking his signet ring and giving it to Haman, versus later the king takes his signet ring and gives it to Mordecai. And again, you can imagine how encouraging that was to the exiles as they read that. And they probably think there's no hope of a Jewish nation. I don't care what the prophets have said. There's no way. We're scattered. There's nothing. And to see that God could do this and overcome this would be very encouraging. And again, hopefully inspire people like Ezra and Nehemiah to come back and begin preparing for what is the only thing remaining really in biblical history, which is the restoration of Israel. Of course, the church wasn't predicted in the Old Testament. So reversal, Purim, this is where, again, a lot of people think the point of the book of Esther is to explain where Purim comes from. It does do that. Purim was the holiday they celebrated when they were able to defend themselves, and it was instead of a day of mourning where they were going to have everything plundered from them and their lives forfeited, it's a day now that they regained their lives and they now give gifts. And it's become, like I said, a very enjoyable Jewish holiday, festival, along with the other feasts that are in the Torah. They celebrate reversal leading to rest. They do have a fasting and lamentation as part of it, but then it results in sort of a really enjoyable feasting, wine and gifts. Just an enjoyable holiday. They actually, I don't know if you've heard of these things. They're just noisemakers. Sometimes they have similar things at soccer matches. But every time when they read, as I mentioned, they read Esther in Purim, and whenever they get to the name of Haman, there's the verse that says, "Blot out the memory of Amalek." They'll run these. You can't do this in a synagogue. You have to be quiet in a synagogue. But when they read Esther, when they get to his name, they do that so nobody hears his name. Really interesting. And again, this is celebrated throughout Israel. It's coming up in March, so it'll be celebrated in this upcoming March. Another theme, this really should be a separate bullet here, but is, again, the casting lots, chance, very similar to providence. Again, you could look at it and say, oh, it's just so circumstantial, so much a chance that he couldn't sleep and he happened to read that. But Purim itself is the idea of a lot or chance, the holiday, the word. Again, we know though that God controls that, and that's why it ended the way it did. Now here's the slide I wanted to put up. Again, it's in a great place in the English canon. We do order it differently. It's actually a little bit, even though we're following chronology, Nehemiah actually comes after it. We talked about how Xerxes was Ahasuerus. He was the king that Esther was married to, and it was Artaxerxes who Nehemiah and Ezra served. So it actually comes after chronologically, but still it's in approximate the right place since we have our books ordered mostly chronologically. But here's the Hebrew canon. So it is in the writings. Frank will take us through Psalms and Job and Proverbs soon. It's in the 5 scrolls section, and they have 5 major holidays, and they read each one of these at one of the holidays. And obviously Esther is read at Purim. It is the last of the 5 scrolls. As I mentioned, it follows Lamentations, and it really sets the stage for these 3 books which talk about the return back to Israel and encourage that. Esther shows that these are very much wisdom for living in the exile. This is going to get into, hey, God's hand is on you. Go back and let's prepare for the kingdom, because that's the next thing to come.
Is that Ninth of Av connected with the destruction of Jerusalem? I've not heard of that one before.
Yes. So this feast, I don't remember which one. I don't remember which feast other than Esther they're at. I guess Passover is obviously here. I don't remember what that Jewish, it's not one of, these are the 3 main ones in the Torah, and then these 2 were added. And I don't remember if that's a feast or if it's just a it wouldn't be a celebration, but a remembrance of the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't recall. I will recall when we get to Lamentations, because I'll restudy it. But okay, just like before, just some good resources. I know I heard you say earlier you don't like the word biblical commentary generally. This is a really good version, a really good reference on it for Esther and Ruth. I mentioned David Howard when we talked about Chronicles, and this, to me, this one article is just really good in explaining the structure of Esther. I have a quote. I'm not gonna read it all, but just it's an interesting quote in one of the commentaries, just talking about, it's a long one, so it's just talking about how Esther must feel to modern Jews, like in the Holocaust, who, God didn't providentially intervene in the same way that he did, and just how that, how modern Jews might read Esther. And but again, it's amazing to think that Israel, as the nation it is, has survived how long that it has. I'm not going to read that long quote, but it will be out there on the web. Next week, we'll be gone. Frank is going to do a review. It sounded like you were going to almost test people. That was...
Well, just as a group. It won't be individual tests. But remember, we talked about this, I think, as we were finishing up the Torah. One of the main things we want to learn is this storyline that runs through the Bible. So what I'll do is ask you questions as a group, like Matt did this morning, of, what's the major theme of this book? How does it continue the story? And we just want to kind of walk through the story. It's a good place for us to do it, because as we get to the wisdom literature, the story doesn't advance. It's a different kind of book. And then when we get to the prophets, Matt will come back up and we'll continue the story at that point. So I just felt like it was a good time to do that.
Yeah. So that'll be enjoyable, and I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll do our scripture memory for the morning. We're getting close. You beat us. You made it through Ephesians before we did, but we're close.
We didn't memorize it this week.
We're going to do what we know so far. So, okay.
It might be better for us today just to exit out this door, just to keep.
Yeah, a lot of people. Okay, it looks like a few minutes.
It is.
I can tell.
Perfect. If you do need to use the restroom, you can definitely do it, but for the bulk of us, we'll exit that way so that we don't interrupt their memorial service. So let me pray for us, and then we'll be dismissed. And we'll do our memory verse, and then we'll be dismissed. Lord, I thank you for the book of Esther. I love the way it's written. I love the story. I love that kids can love the story and enjoy it and appreciate it. And I just thank you for your care for Israel and for how encouraging that is to me, even not as a part of Israel, but just seeing how when you set your love on someone, you don't stop. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. You continue loving them even when they're under your discipline and scattered and really vulnerable to the nations, because they didn't have a homeland and they didn't have any strength, and you cared for them in that, Father. Even as I mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, where it pictures you going into exile with them and just your care for them. And then I think about the church and how you've chosen us in a very similar way, Lord. You've chosen us to be a kingdom of priests, as it were, a beloved nation, as it were, holy people. And I just think about how that same love that you show to Esther is the kind of love that you would have for me. And I thank you for that, Lord. And I just pray that you would help us to be encouraged, that you'll never cast us off. And also, Father, in the way that you desire the remnant, the faithful remnant, in the way you desired them to go back and to work and to obey and to serve you, that this kind of love that you have and show would be an encouragement to us to act that same way and to trust that you're going to care for us and work everything out for our good, even though we don't see miracles and we don't have prophecies or tongues or gifts of healing or many of the things that we know were true and were a part of your early church. We can know, Father, that your good hand is on us as well, and we can be free to serve you and to trust you no matter what comes. Help us to love you with all of our heart. In Jesus' name, amen.